can be. So we're really excited to have you here. And yeah, welcome to MiCHAMP.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Pramaji. I really appreciate this invite, and I'm so glad to be speaking with not to, but with, because this is early stage work that I'm presenting today, and I would love to get your feedback and thoughts on our work. I'm going to share my screen in a quick bit. You see my slides and not my notes, right? Okay, so
we just see your slides.
Perfect. Great. Awesome. Thank you. So hello and welcome everyone. I'm Rahul, as Brahmaji just introduced, so I'm not going to repeat that. Before I begin, a big thank you to Brahmaji for having me present to this group and to Rebecca for coordinating this. Today I'll be talking about our work on personalizing treatment assignment vaccine uptake in behavioral science field experiments. So as Brahmaji already laid out the sort of, groundwork in terms of the mega study approach that the group at Penn called the Behavior Change for Good Initiative has sort of pioneered. And this work builds upon that, where how can we personalize these interventions for our patients? And I'll come to that in a quick bit. So again, I just wanted to use this opportunity because to introduce myself to the group, because I joined Michigan at the peak of the pandemic in 2020, and haven't really had much face-to-face time until this fall. So my primary research interests are in adaptation and application of machine learning methods for causal inference in healthcare and behavior science. And this interest in behavior science was kindled during my postdoc at Penn with this group, which conducts one of these mega studies, right? Massive, by real world standards, not by digital standards, multi-arm randomized trials in partnership with organizations such as health systems, national pharmacies, gym chains. The 24-hour fitness paper that we talked about, I think a few months ago in the Journal Club was an example. And they are done for testing the efficacy of these behavior science and psych theory informed interventions to effect behavior change. So I want to sort of talk about 2 or 3 of my big chunks of the research interest. So, if there's anybody who has similar interest, I'd love to sort of talk about them later or after the talk as well. So a big part of the work that I do is, and this is from my thesis work, is data-driven estimation of treatment effect heterogeneity. How can we combine observational data, which is large, but messy and plausibly confounded with unobserved confounding, with small, though clean experimental data for heterogeneity effect subgroup learning and validation. Other work that I've been doing, which is largely in line with the work at BCFG, how do we personalize treatment assignments in real world experiments, especially when you have such a large number of arms. For example, the gym study we did had 50 different treatment arms with almost like 1,000 to 2,000 participants per arm. So I think as statisticians would know, that makes it a very underpowered problem to estimate heterogeneity, let alone personalization. So some of the work which I'm not covering today is my work is about developing methods where we could learn personalized treatment assignment rules in these specific settings. Some global public health work that I've been doing recently is in the area of digital vaccines for behavior change, which essentially leverages these gamified digital interventions for nudging behavior change in low and middle income countries. So for example, we just finished one round of an RCT we are running in Chennai in public schools in India, where we're trying to embed these mHealth-based games in the classroom curriculum to see the effect of these virtual neurocognitive training on actual food choices and physical activity and other clinical parameters that we can collect from them.
Rahul, why do you call them digital vaccines? I'm curious.
That's a great question. So this is actually a subcategory of this thing called digital therapeutics, right? Where they leverage. So the analogy with a physical vaccine is that you deliver them this game-based intervention, right, in doses. And the hypothesis being that implicitly there will be this neurocognitive training, right, of the individual's brain, and that will lead to real-world behavior change. And you're going to keep dosing it, to ensure that there is a significant level of, let's say, and again, this is something that I'm using from a Michigan alumnus, who is the sort of, patented founder of this subgenre, right, of immune to, let's say, bad behavior using mobile games, so to say. But yeah, so this is ongoing work, and again, happy to talk about it in more detail offline with folks who are interested. So quick, usually I skip this slide because when I talk to folks in behavior change and behavior science, but for this group, which is a very diverse group, I'll just give a quick intro to the context and why behavior science and psych theory informed interventions are cool and important. So a bunch of premature deaths have been demonstrated to be linked to potentially changeable behavior, diet, exercises, recommended screenings. And again, this doesn't sort of, take away from the importance of SDOH or the social determinants of health and what should be done at a macro level. But if we can move the needle even marginally on micro levels at the individual level, why not take these inexpensive scalable strategies to affect behavior change? And research in behavior economics and psych theory have shown so many of these nudges and planning and prompts and incentives, right, have been shown across multiple settings like vaccine uptake today, which I'll talk about, to gym visits, to savings, to preventative screenings, to move that needle, albeit marginally, but still a significant move at a relatively costless or inexpensive approach. So today I'll be talking about these two mega studies, which were conducted in 3 settings for nudging the flu shot vaccine uptake. Now, why mega studies? Because these are these massive field experiments in which the effects of many different interventions are compared in the same population on the same objectively measured outcome for the same duration. So as Brahmaji was alluding to in the initial part of the discussion, right? I mean, it sort of is a lot of advantages of this approach is that it removes the file drawer effect, or essentially you pick and choose which works and which doesn't work. And as opposed to sort of just completely being transparent about, hey, we tried these 20, 30 different psychological hypotheses. So many of them had the null effect. These things worked. These things did not work. So essentially, gives an incentive to be, and again, all of these are pre-registered. So removes the p-hacking part out of one of the critiques that you usually have for research done in this space. So in fall 2020, 2 large multi-arm randomized trials or mega studies were conducted at these 3 settings: Penn Medicine and Geisinger health systems, and the Walmart pharmacy system. And they tested dozens of these text messages designed to encourage individuals to get the flu vaccine. Now, this was in fall 2020, before the COVID vaccine was even available. And I was at Penn when these studies were getting off the ground, right? And there was this crazy massive push to get these things out, because though flu and COVID vaccine are different, obviously there are huge differences between them, right? But we were interested in seeing that how some of these hypotheses might be transferable, that whether some of these behavioral science theories could be used when it comes to actually making people take the COVID vaccine as well. So for the next few slides, I'll talk briefly about these 2 studies, which is, and this work has been published already, so I'm not going to be focusing on this during this talk, but just to lay out the context for the group here. So for the first mega study published in PNAS, we had patients at Penn Medicine and Geisinger health systems, 2 large Northeastern health systems, and patients who had appointments at Penn Medicine, 30 clinics in Philadelphia, and around 56 Geisinger primary health clinics all across Pennsylvania in this 2-month period were eligible. And we tested 19 different experimental conditions plus 1 holdout control, and they were randomized simultaneously. Now, patients in the holdout control condition received only the standard appointment SMS reminders from the health system, like the date, time, and location of appointments. In the 19 experimental conditions, in addition to all of these details, patients were sent intervention text messages, which varied the content of the text messages, interactive components linked to external videos and surveys, or some humor or some joke or some video, variable number of messages, and the timing of text messages. And the sample size was around 48,000, 50,000, 48,000, and it increased later because we kept the study on for longer after publication in PNAS, where the patients were around 52 years on average, dominantly female, and 70% white. And we had detailed clinical history data available because all these patients had records at the Penn Medicine and Geisinger health system. So essentially, we have all their comorbidities, the history over the last couple of years, and so on and so forth. So an example of the kind of messages that was sent, right? So let's say for a patient who has an appointment, 2 texts were sent, 172 hours, and this is one condition. There were 19 different conditions like this, right? So let's call this the flu shot reserved for you condition, where one message was sent 3 days before the appointment, and one message was sent 24 hours before the appointment. This is an example, yeah. And the first message was essentially, John, this is a message from Penn Medicine about your appointment. And and then towards the end, we have, it's flu season, a flu vaccine is available for you, protect yourself and your family's health. 24 hours prior to the appointment, we again sent a reminder that, John, this is a reminder that the flu vaccine has been reserved for you for your appointment with Dr. Smith. So essentially sort of inculcating ownership of that, or something that's being kept for you, waiting for you at the location. Other messages, as I mentioned, were about interactive, say yes, say no, and frequency. Like this message was 2 texts, some messages were just 1 text, some messages were 2 texts, 72 hours and 15 minutes pre-appointment. You can see these details in the paper. This paper was focused on the average treatment effect finding, right? And they essentially sort of ranked all these interventions, right, based on which was the most effective. And the flu shot reserved for you, which I just showed, was found to be the most effective. Now, again, take this with a pinch of salt. I mean, with all the folks who are already thinking about multiple testing and those other concerns, right? Clearly, that's a concern here, right? I mean, you see the sheer overlap in the 95% CIs for all these patients. I mean, you can ask yourself, right? Is flu shot reserved for you with 2 texts, 72 hours and 24 hours as different from, let's say, I don't know, the 72 hours and 15 minutes and so on, right? So that's something that definitely was one of the critiques also, which they acknowledge in the paper. Similarly, Walmart Pharmacy, I'm going to run through this a bit faster. This was in a different context, not with patients, but Walmart Pharmacy folks who, in the customers essentially in the US, who had received a flu shot at a Walmart during the 2019-20 flu season, but had not received a flu shot this flu season, the 2020 fall season. Now, again, they didn't have any sort of ongoing relationships with the system as Penn, Geisinger, and patients had. So you can imagine the low dimensional space we're operating in here. Here again, there were 22 different experimental conditions plus 1 control randomized simultaneously, and patients were sent intervention. There was no appointment here, remember? It was essentially just patients who had gotten a flu shot and they were sent these messages. The sample here was more than 10 times large, right? Almost 700,000. Much older, not much, relatively older population, more % female, and a key problem in this one from our study, which I'll come to in a bit, was that 84% had missing race ethnicity data. And for whom that we had race ethnicity data, 80% were white. And others were sort of, there. So again, you can think about the 2 conditions we're talking about, the 2 settings we're talking about, large N, small d, small n, large d, and then again, different contexts and relationships we are operating in here. So this is again an example of the flu shot waiting for you that was sent to Walmart Pharmacy patients. Again, it's flu season, you can get a flu shot. The message is very similar to what was sent for flu shot reserved for you, except now there's no sort of an appointment and so on, right? In association with the message that's being sent. And again, they did something similar. Now, clearly, they had a much larger sample size, right? Because you had around 30,000 sort of patients per arm. And you did see all the 22 conditions being statistically significantly different from 0 compared to the control, right? But again, very overlapping in the 95% CI. So if I were to ask you whether the flu shot waiting for you with the 2 texts is very dissimilar from encouraging others to get a flu shot, that might be a hard question to answer. So that, yeah.
Can you just give us a sense, like in this study in particular, like what was the absolute rate of flu vaccination in the cohort? So what is it a 1% increase over 10% or 20% or?
Right, it's a good question. So 30% or 29.2% specifically was in the control group, right? They had and who got the flu shot vaccine at Walmart. So if you would see that compared to the 30% denominator, it's a 3 percentage point increase that the best arm gets you, right? Which is like a 10% increase. Still, sort of, by that benchmark is significant, right? So, right, so yeah. Okay. And similarly, I think in the Penn Geisinger, it was like 40%. And for the first wave that was published in the PNAS, and then when they had the whole sort of wave extending beyond December 2020, again 30% people got the flu shot in the control condition, and 3 to 4% was the percentage point increase that they saw because of the best performing arm. So very similar rates of treatment effects across the 2 settings. Now, studies evaluating the efficacy of these interventions, and the two included, as you just saw, right, have focused on and are powered to identify, if at all, the one best strategy that can move the needle, on average, the farthest. And like subgroup analysis, if any, which was done in the previous one, the two papers as well, right, focused on these treatment effect variations across predefined subgroups. And that was largely done via, interactions with gender, age bands, race, etc., using like parametric OLS approaches. So not letting much of the data-driven interaction, which let's say ML methods can be useful for, having a role to play. And nothing significant popped out. I essentially sort of had led the heterogeneity estimation part for the Walmart pharmacy. And again, it's just after a point, you're just looking at a million different combinations, and what do you do with that, right? So again, this focus on the average treatment effect can come at the expense of ignoring more granular treatment effect heterogeneity. And doing so can be a missed opportunity at best, and worse, could perpetuate disparities if you think about race ethnic subgroups and so on, right? It's here that machine learning methods can be useful, because they can flexibly estimate these interactions and come to the move beyond the what works on average for everyone to the what works for whom paradigm. So the kind of questions that we were interested in answering, leveraging data from these two studies, were number one was essentially, can ML-driven personalization of behavioral interventions be more effective than assigning everyone to the best for all intervention? Now, to the best of our knowledge, a lot of the personalization stuff is being done with, Facebook and Google's of the world, because clearly they have like millions and millions, if not billions of data points to do that, right? But in the real world, this question always hits this power benchmark, not roadblock. And we were like, we could leverage this large data sizes that we have to see whether something can pop out. Second was, and this was a part of the RWJF funded grant that we were working on, is what are the implications of racial disparities for personalization gains? As you saw, the population that we had was like 80% white for the non-missing value in Walmart, and 70% white for all of Penn Geisinger. So what happens when you apply an algorithm learned on a largely sort of non-Hispanic white population to subgroups in the data? And going on from that, right, and some of this is a work in progress, is examine transferability of the personalization rules across these settings and the subgroups. Okay, so any questions before I move on to the next part of it?
Anybody have any questions? All right, go ahead, Rahul.
Perfect. So now ML methods for personalization. Now there's a rich literature sorry, my thing is turned off. Yeah. Rich literature at the intersection of econometrics, stats, and computer science and learning, treatment assignment rules, and treatment effect heterogeneity. A lot of approaches for flexible estimation leverage, first of all, you figure out the heterogeneous treatment effects, one-to-one treatment versus control, and leverage them or backtrack them to optimize assignment, the max of which of these effects was the max compared to the control, right? Other approaches essentially directly optimize the utility of assignment of individuals to the treatment, or the probability of assigning individuals. So like it becomes more of a classification problem, as in Zhao et al. With outcome-weighted learning and so approaches. In our current approach, and again, it's changing because some of our work, which I'm not presenting today, has been about developing methods or extending forest and tree methods to learn treatment assignment rules in these large treatment space settings, because most of these other arms, the methods we talked about, except for the policy tree method, have been sort of tested dominantly on binary treatment settings and so on. So for our current approach, we are applying multi-arm causal forests, which are a multivariate extension of the R-learner, on held out patients across the two settings, the Walmart and the Penn Geisinger settings as one, to estimate the individual treatment effects for each of the patients. And then we train the personalization algorithm using these population subgroups to assess the transferability, and again, also with or without race variables, because one of the key motivators for the grant proposal that we had was to see how race or racial disparities played a role here. So
Rahul,
yeah,
it looks like Jenna has a question.
Sure. Should I go to the chat or?
No,
Jenna?
sorry, I could just ask it if that's okay.
Go ahead.
I joined late, so maybe I missed this, or maybe this is what you're about to show, but I'm curious, was the average treatment effect different once you condition on male versus female? Like it sounds like you're going to personalize beyond just someone's sex, but when you look at the average treatment effect, did it differ once you conditioned on that one variable?
Right, that's a good question, because and we did all of that for both the Penn, Geisinger and the Walmart settings separately, right? By age, by gender, by age bins and gender. And we could not find a statistically significant difference in the ATE, right? And again, just to sort of be more modeling specific about what we did, right, for the original average treatment effect paper, was to sort of just run one more OLS model with, interactions with gender with each of the treatments. And it didn't really stand out, so to say. So yeah, it wasn't like a cool story as such. If that answers the question, Jenna.
Got it. So I was just curious, like, how much evidence is there for personalization? But it sounds like, so gender alone or sex alone isn't enough. You need to combine it with other things. Okay.
Right. I think that was the motivation, because with the existing approaches, right, and we were like, okay, to what extent can you hack your way through? You could possibly do it, the models for all these combinations, right? Again, you could, yeah. So we were like, even the age bins, for example, right? We could have just we actually did that, interacted each of the age bins of interest with the treatments to see what were the coefficients. And again, that's subject to a bunch of assumptions, of course, right? Parametric assumptions, of course, and doesn't let these free-flowing interactions have a role. And we thought maybe that might be more helpful here.
Got it. Thanks.
So what do we find? We found that personalization does make a substantial difference. This is what you see here essentially is row 1 of this table, right? Shows the percentage point increase in the flu shot uptake or the treatment effect compared to the control. So this is essentially the average of the individualized treatment effects estimated by the policy, by the multiple causal forest algorithm, right? When you assign each individual to their optimal flu shot message in comparison to control. The second method shows the percentage point increase for the standard approach of assigning everyone to the same, on average, best performing message. And the third one essentially is the gains, what essentially is like row 1 over row 2 from personalization. Now, as you can see here, right, I mean, the gains were largely of a similar magnitude across the two settings, and pretty substantial differences. Now, if you remember, 30% was the denominator, right, of or what was the control group average flu shot rate. So if you would look at that percentage point increase, right, so 6% versus 2%, right, you could see how significant these differences were.
So what's the personalization based on? I know you're using causal forest, but what are the inputs?
I'm sorry, I should have specified that. So for this round of sort of comparing the two settings, we used variables which were similar across both these settings. And these essentially were age, gender, race, and I'm going to talk about Walmart in a quick bit, what we did for Walmart, because there was 88% was missing. And we had for Walmart, 6 of these comorbidities: diabetes, hypertension, and an indicator 1 or 0 for that. And we had whether or not they had received a flu shot in each of the last 5 years at Penn Geisinger for the Penn Geisinger setting and at Walmart for the Walmart setting. So we had like 15, 16 variables that went into the personalization algorithm. I'm sorry, I should have put that slide on. I missed that.
I just want to also make sure, like, just so I understand this is all like you did the experiment and then you saw the average results, and then you're going back retrospectively and just seeing if we had binned. So this has nothing to do with anything you assigned prospectively and saw these differences.
No, this is not an adaptive stuff that we did. In fact, one of the proposals we had as an off tangent, right, was to make this study an adaptive study, right? We were like 20, let's screen down to a fewer one, like a batched sort of assignment approach, but that didn't fly through with the partners. So this is all retrospective based on the data that we had. And also, let me add one more thing about the race variable, right, for Walmart. Now, as I mentioned, 84% of our patients in Walmart had their race ethnicity information missing. But we had the zip codes of all the sort of Walmart pharmacy patients. So essentially what we did, when I come to the next slide comparing non-white and white, there is the folks in the sample who were in the zip codes in the top 25 percentile of zip codes with the highest white percentage across the US. And the non-white here were patients from zip codes with the bottom 25 percentile of white white residents in those zip codes, because that was the sort of, thing that we could do with. Thoughts on how could we use the 15% non-missing race information, right, for Walmart would be very much welcome when we come towards the end. Then the other thing that we were interested in was to sort of, replicate the same analysis, but by non-whites and whites, to examine the benefits and gains of implementing personalization behavioral strategies. Again, as can be seen, right, the benefits and gains for personalization are comparable across non-whites and whites. If you look at compare across the columns, and suggesting lack of clear disparities in benefits of personalization. And as I mentioned, for Walmart, we didn't have data on race, so this essentially is for the patients from those two zip codes.
Rahul, I'm a little bit surprised by this because you have so much more data for white patients. I would have expected the personalization to play a bigger role just because of the sheer amount of data.
Right, and I'm gonna show this to you in the next slide about when we train the algorithm only on whites with non-whites and so on. So let's say for whites, right, it was 70% of the 47,000 patients, right? So like 34,000 patients were white and the rest were non-white in the Penn Geisinger setting. But for the Walmart, white and non-white is the same because it's the top 25% of patients of the 700,000, right, which would be around 175K would be white and 175K would be non-white, if that makes sense. Okay. I'm not sure if Jenna, you got it. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks.
Okay, sure. Yeah. And I'm going to now go to the next table, which was sort of, so let's go to the next table and talk a bit about that because it's something that I would love to get your thoughts on as well, right? Not this one, sorry. This is essentially just a visualization of the results we saw earlier by non-whites and whites, essentially showing that there was not much changes or disparities in how the algorithm performed for whites and non-whites in the data that we had across the two settings. Now, another perspective that we wanted to examine was if there were differences in the effectiveness of the behavioral interventions by race, is to add race to the covariates for personalization and to see if that would improve the benefits further. The results that I showed to you earlier did not include race in the personalization. We consciously chose to leave out race from the results to see whether including or not including has any effect on the things. And we could not, and you can see that it's comparing race row 2 to row 1 with race and without race, shows that adding race does not really lead to significant improvements. Now, third column essentially is the same thing that you saw earlier, but this is 6.33% when you include race. And the other measures are remarkably in a similar vein. Yet another perspective that we wanted to sort of examine was if there was a consistent disadvantage for one race, if one were to train the algorithm only on the non-white population or only on the white population. So essentially, what you're looking here is that the algorithm here, the row 3 was trained only on the non-white population, and we want to see what were the effects for non-whites and applying to whites. And similarly for Walmart, applying the algorithm only on the non-white population to train it, but testing it on the non-white and the white to see what the sort of inferences were. And again, these things did not make much of a difference between non-whites and whites across the two settings. But what really stuck out for us, right, and which we have continued to examine, right, how, if you'll notice, right, when I trained the algorithm on the non-white population alone, right, how it's leading to larger gains of personalization for whites than it's for non-whites. Similarly, when I train the algorithm for white population alone, how it's leading to larger gains for non-whites and whites. And that sort of, struck me as, hey, is this a mistake that I've done? So we went through the code multiple times, but we could not really sort of, assess what was the thing that was, standing out for us. But again, we could not see any disparities, right, between the columns, so to say. So one of the key asks of us was to sort of figure out whether or not there are racial disparities in this. We did not find that from this. Any questions before I move on to the next slide? Okay, so and again, from using a forest approach, typically you can sort of rank your variables of importance, right? And what we saw that across all the algorithms, and all these columns essentially say that you are using the whole data or subgroups of the data to train your algorithm, or and whether or not you're using race as a covariate or not. And across all these algorithms, right, none of them popped out race as the top 5 variables, right, which were important in determining whether or not, the personalization rule, so to say. And as not expected, but as a bunch of science theory or literature in the behavior science space demonstrates, right, previous behavior is one of the strongest indicator for future behavior. And we found that flu shot in the previous years, right, just stood out, was blaring across the board, right, for across all these trained algorithms. And so were certain some of the sort of comorbidities that we had indicators for in our data.
Can I ask a quick question, Rahul? When you look at these, I just want to understand if I'm picturing the features correctly. Like, are these just predicting whether or not you get a flu shot, or whether or not that treatment effect of like the messaging enhances? It's
so the latter, yeah, exactly. It's not about, so it's how much of a role did they play in the causal forest, so to say, right, of these variables. Yeah,
I'm a little like, I agree that like for predicting like whether someone gets a flu shot, like getting a flu shot in 2017 and 2019, that would do it. And maybe, but I just wanted to make sure that I understood that it still plays a role in terms of that incremental advantage of a messaging, which I think is an important differentiation. So, okay, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. And I think this then comes to, this is an example of one of the sort of trees that we generated, right? I mean, using the policy tree approach by Wager, right? Where you sort of take the estimated individual treatment effects, and then you fit that into this doubly robust policy tree, right? And this policy tree is sort of, I won't use the word hackable, but based on the number of levels that you want your tree to be, right, which comes at the expense of insane amount of computational time, but you might get different results in case you had sort of, 3 levels or 4 levels of this policy tree. So I wouldn't place like an insane amount of importance on this one. But this is just an example that, let's say age and insurance, right, were 2 variables, let's say, when we tried for Walmart patients, which popped out in terms of which messages they should be sent as such.
Rahul, it didn't seem to be the case based on the plots that you showed previously, but are messages ever harmful in this scenario? Like nothing seemed to overlap with 0. But I could imagine in other cases for behavior modification, if my phone tells me to, take extra steps, I
want
some autonomy over my phone, so I don't do it.
Right. I mean, and that would sort of imply that, you have the control as one of the sort of root, the leaf nodes of this tree, right? We didn't find that, Jenna. I mean, across most of these, I don't recollect seeing the control ever outpacing, for any of the subgroups in the setting. That being said, right, I mean, as I was just mentioning earlier, things might change. Let's say if I made it like 4 levels or 3 levels of this tree, so to say, right? I mean, and to see whether there's ever a subgroup of interest for which the control, which is not sending any reminder message at all to the patients, would be more effective.
Rahul, it does raise an interesting issue. Were these patients consented in any way, or was it like waived? Because, I could see what Jenna's mentioning if you just send unsolicited texts versus ones where people have consented to participate.
That's a great question, because for both these settings, one of the inclusion criteria was that patients had consented to receive text messages from Walmart or from the health systems. That was definitely one of the criteria for inclusion in the study. And I think you also had, yeah, exactly, right, yeah. Okay, so essentially, broadly, what we find across these initial set of preliminary analyses, right, that the findings are across these two very different data settings and contexts, right? One where you have more of a relationship with your health system, right? One which is more of a casual, I got a flu shot with Walmart last year, and that is consenting me to send a text message with them. But it sort of demonstrates how effective personalization can be than assigning everyone the on average best message, so to say, right? And race did not seem to be a significant factor for these messages. Now, that being said, we haven't accounted yet for granularities in non-white groups to examine the potential uptakes within them. Now, again, we can do that for Penn Geisinger because we have their race information. As I mentioned, we were 70% white. The rest 30% were divvied up between white and non-white. But for the first pass, we just went with white and non-white because we could have a comparison with Walmart from the percentage white metric, but that's something that we are taking up. The other thing that's actually ongoing, and I'm sort of putting in place for a conference talk next week, is whether when you generalize across Penn, Geisinger, and Walmart settings. Now, as I mentioned, for this pass, we purposely chose variables which were common across the two settings. And the 19 arms and the 22 arms, of those arms, 6 arms are common across Penn, Geisinger, and Walmart. So what would be really interesting is to see whether rules that we have learned from the Penn Geisinger setting, right, in a very different sort of ecosystem of relationships with the patient and the provider would be transferable to the Walmart setting and vice versa. So that sort of is something that's ongoing right now. And then again, I think this is something that we've got because of, again, the Behavior Change for Good initiative. There was like one more study by one of the co-authors on the original PNAS work, right, where they did the study. It's a two-state study aimed at the COVID-19 vaccine. Again, behavioral messages, different hypotheses, not as insane as 20, 30 different arms, but 4 or 6 arms. And we're sort of now working with them to see how we can see whether or not personalization effective or not effective, and whether if there's any overlap of the treatment arm hypotheses, whether that works across COVID and the flu shot vaccine studies. But with that, I mean, I think I would love to ask for questions and any thoughts that you have. And this is my group, which I worked with: Nina Mazar from BU, Lailanger from Penn, and Wenbo Wu, who was a former student at Biostats, Michigan, but now is working as a faculty at NYU.
All right, Rahul. Well, thank you so much for a great overview. You're doing so much interesting work. So I think Jenna is asking probably the question that's on the forefront of lots of people's mind, which is, do you think that prospectively, and I don't know how you did this, did you just like take like 80% of your sample, create the model, and then the numbers you were showing are in an held out sample? But, you know, we have learned the lesson so many times that retrospectively, like creating bins, and then, you know, that may not show up. So yeah, is there a plans for this? Do you think it will have an impact on this? How confident do you feel about this? And then Mike Mathis has his hand raised up after too, so.
Gotcha. No, that's actually a great question. And as I was mentioning earlier, right, one of the key reasons why we were pushing Katie and Angela to make this a 2-stage study, right, as opposed to a 1-stage study, was to do this some sort of a, you know, adaptive or prospective test. Because as of now, you're just sort of running with what you have, right? Though now, and I'm sort of in early talks with the group, right, they are doing one more study with Uber and with CVS on some of the booster stuff, right? So that might be and I think they are more amenable to some sort of an adaptiveness, because earlier, because it was so fast paced, right, that there was not much, Walmart wasn't giving them an inch at all in terms of how they would get it going. So to long answer short, I think as of now, it's still on the drawing board. But since so many of these rules that I showed earlier, right, for example, the policy tree, right, is, I mean, it definitely would need a validation sort of a thing, right, to see whether or not that subgroup, this is the most effective intervention or not, so to say.
You know, this is just a plug for in a couple of weeks. Mike is talking with Walter Dempsey on one of our seminars, and you know, Mike's leading a clinical trial here where after 2 months, there's an actual randomization looking at, this is also a digital health intervention, but, you know, using some rules developed based on how the intervention has worked for different groups and stuff in the earlier period to kind of continue it on. So I think there's a lot of excitement about this, and yeah, no, so I think that's a wonderful thing. I hope you guys are able to do that. So
that's a good story. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Mathis?
Yeah, Rahul, was awesome talk, fascinating stuff. Excited for what this might be in store for, for my own in my own self-interest, the R01 grant that we're working on with managing patients getting cardiac surgery. But the question I have, in this study, whenever the treatments are, the administration of the treatment is like an automated thing, if it's done in an automated way, there's not much of a cost of like adding lots of complexity to the, you can make this tree come, have like 10 branches, and you don't lose too much, and just making things infinitely personalized. I don't see too many downsides to that. But when the treatment assigner is not just like an automated algorithm, but it's like a person, like a clinician. It seems like there is a cost to, there's some amount of standardization that is good when a clinician is just, that you can follow a standardized approach generally much more easily than an individualized approach. And so there's some trade-off between maximizing the overall treatment effect versus the ability to like create simple benchmarks for clinicians to, low-hanging fruit for clinicians to follow on like how they might do better. And maybe that's more of a sociology question than it is an e-hail question. But I'm just like, is there a way to like measure that cost of like introducing complexity to clinical treatment algorithms and making things infinitely personalized and having clinicians frustrated when you have like a 10-arm or a 10-branch policy tree?
That's a very good question, actually. And I think the first thing that I thought was, this is kind of related to the other algorithm that you're working on, right? Which is about when you have 50 different treatment arms, what level should you grow your tree, right? And I think a bunch of that is whether the marginal benefits, whether it's really worth it, right, to go by one more epsilon on the overall treatment effect, right? And again, that epsilon could really be very contextual in what setting you're working on. You're right, in the automation setup, it doesn't cost much to send text messages to, let's say, South Asian men less than 25, belonging to, let's say, Philadelphia. But I think, let's say, as you rightly said, like for a clinician, those level of granularities, I don't even think might be possible to learn from the data that you might have in a real world setting, right? Because even, let's say, for this tree, I think, right, I mean, how much of this would be subject to noise given once the data shrinks, you really can't grow your tree beyond that point anyway. So I think it's, I don't know if I answered your question, but I think it's the balance between how much the data that you have to train your algorithm on, plus the marginal value that you're getting with each level of personalization, right? So let's, for example, in our tree, we cut the tree off at a certain epsilon for sure. We don't even let the tree grow, right? So I think if that's the approach I would suggest.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. I'm like struggling on like how to quantify that like cost of like just building another branch, but it seems like there is a cost. It's like some emotional cost that you have as a clinician trying to follow all these rules and giving up autonomy. But seems like I'm struggling for a way to measure it. I think it's a tough problem to solve.
Absolutely, yeah.
Rahul, Larry had a question. Larry, do you want to just mention it? I mean, it's in the chat.
Yeah. So, interesting talk. It seems to me that there's really a balance here. In these kinds of messaging, you're using computerized messaging going to people's phones, I assume.
Right.
So it's a relatively trivial cost, right, to do that. And it seems to me personalization is much more effective if there's a high transactional cost of providing the message relative to the value you get with the personalization. If you were able to provide that low cost intervention with different messages serially over, the flu season runs from October to February. So over that period of time, you could provide different messages to a group of people, not personalized, but but hitting some of the topics that you identify in the beginning. And the question is that serial non-personalized approach more effective than a 1 or 2 time personalized approach? And it's just a cost benefit.
Right. So if I understand your question correctly, I mean, essentially saying that the personalization becomes worth it only if, let's say, there is some sort of a ranking of costs to certain messages or not, right? I mean, let's say, so if certain messages are costly to send, then you do the sort of a cost benefit from the treatment effect minus what's the cost to send those messages thing. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we didn't, so yeah, the thing with automated messages across the board, right, was that we didn't really have any cost to sending that. For the gym study that we had done, we were giving people gifts like Audible Notebook and which were like $3-4 at max. We did not evaluate how those costs would come into the optimizing criteria for the tree growth, but I can imagine that could still be part of the objective function, right? So let's say if I were to grow my personalized tree based on this objective function where you have y, which is 1, 0, whether or not you get the flu shot, minus what's the average cost of sending that text message or that intervention to that person, that might be the way to do it. Does that make sense? Am I getting your question right at all?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I think to some extent you looked at people who had a flu shot, right? So it's kind of low-hanging fruit. The more interesting thing would be people who didn't take a flu shot, right? What motivates them to get a flu shot? Years ago we did a study where we looked at women who were Medicare women who hadn't used the mammography benefit over 5 years.
Okay.
And then we worked with CMS and actually wrote to those women and let them know that this is a benefit, and gave them options of why they should have it, and had a brochure and all that kind of thing. That came from CMS, not from us. And then followed up, 2 years later to see how many of those women that hadn't used that benefit in 5 years were in, compared to controls, were received that benefit. So I think the people that, the low-hanging fruit is fine, but the rotten fruit on the ground is probably more valuable to try to motivate them to do something. But it's hard.
No, absolutely. That's a great point, because I think in both these settings that I talked about, right, one of the criteria for inclusion was that you had, at least in the Walmart, was that you had gotten a flu shot last year at Walmart, right? So that sort of, again, these were the low-hanging fruits. But you bring an interesting point, and that's what the COVID study that I sort of alluded to towards the end of my talk, right, does, that they have like a two-state setup. Not an adaptive one, but essentially that they send a bunch of 2-3 messages to UCLA Health patients, and to the patients who don't respond or haven't gotten the COVID vaccine at UCLA Health, as in the records, they do the second stage of the intervention. So I think that might sort of be more in line with what you were saying, Larry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all interesting. I'm not. I'm just saying that it's always more of a challenge to find motivation for people that don't do something than for people who've already made the decision to do it at least once.
Exactly, right. I think it's a trade-off between the data availability you have, right? I mean, ideally, wonderful to get the whole universe, right? But yeah.
Well, you probably have Walmart people that didn't get the flu shot, right? That have already said that they don't mind being contacted. So you have that sort of population to go after. Anyhow.
Right. And I think just to add, I saw Jenna's point as well, right? So it does include people who did not get a flu shot for the Penn Geisinger setup. Because Penn Geisinger, we did not have a requirement that they have to have a flu shot. For Walmart, that was the only way to have a sort of, a target sample for targeting with the messages.
Rahul, I'm going to ask one last question. It's going to tie a little bit into what Jeremy's point was, and then I'm going to give it over to Jenna just to make an announcement. So is Geisinger, UPenn, Walmart using this now? Has it been operationalized? And if so, Jeremy's question comes to the point of like drift over time, and do you have to redo these studies? Do you recalibrate? I'm just kind of curious how you think about that. But do you know, like, because these findings have now been published, and are they adopting these, or?
That's a very good question, and I should. I don't know much about that. I know I saw a CVS message the other day with some sort of a reserve for you setup. And I know CVS is becoming a partner with BCFG in the coming fall, later this fall, right? But I don't know whether or not Penn eventually adapted. Even because the personalization hasn't been published, of course, but even the two PNAS studies, right? I'm not sure if Penn or Walmart ran with it after that.
Okay, wonderful. Jenna, do you want to take a moment here?
Yeah, I wanted to steal 1 minute to tell you about an event that's taking place tomorrow. So this is the AI Symposium. So it will happen all day. This is focused on AI and accessibility. You may be interested. And then the second thing, and it's free. The second thing that I want to make sure that was on everyone's radar was this week, we were really fortunate to host Eric Horvitz to deliver the Tanner Lecture at Michigan. And for those who missed it, it's on YouTube. So I just put the links in the chat there. The talk was phenomenal. I highly, highly recommend watching it. And then there was a panel the next day that was really terrific. So this is, if you're interested on, where AI is headed, and it does cover health topics, but it's also much broader. And yeah, it was excellent. For those who don't know, Eric is responsible for the little lightning bolt in Microsoft Word. Every time you do auto format and the little lightning bolt that comes up, that was his idea.
Not the paperclip. Not the paperclip.
And the paperclip, but he's not as proud as that one, obviously.
I will have to say, I had a chance to meet with him after, Jenna's spoken a lot about him, and he was wonderful, just kind of in a broad setting. So thanks for sharing those links, Jen. I couldn't make the talk, but I look forward to watching those later. Rahul, thank you. It's after midnight in India.
I'm back. I'm back to the US.
I know, but you're still on India time, man. You just got back in. So I'm super impressed that you were able to give this talk, and we're really excited to have you as part of this community. Actually, I think you bring a lot into this, and I hope Mike, we should connect with Rahul. And Rahul, I'm going to try to send you the link when Walter Dempsey talks about this, because this idea of optimizing policies over time is really hugely important. I think it's a way of like really tackling the fact that there's just at face value, there's this idea that there is going to be heterogeneity in how we all respond to these different nudges, and being able to study this in kind of a perspective manner will be really fun. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. All right. Have a great weekend.
Take care.
Thanks so much.